What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Haze Demon Show. And we're going to be starting a brand new series where I am going to be reading for you guys Resident Evil books. I have been wanting to do some audiobook type dealios for a long time now, and I think now is the perfect time to do it. It is a little bit of October Halloween related. I have here 7 books of particular nature. They are the Resident Evil books. We've got Resident Evil Zero Hour by S.D. Perry. All these books were written by S.D. Perry. I got these books whenever I was a young lad, a young lassie indeed, a young teenager, older teenager, whatever. I owned all, there's 7 of these books, and I would like to read them all for you, a couple chapters at a time, each day. Hopefully, that is what it'll be coming up. Um, I actually was missing one of these books to the collection. I'll show you which one here in a minute. But I was able to order it and get it within a couple days for only $4. So I was pretty happy with that because I forgot that I was missing it. Somebody had taken it, I'm pretty sure is what happened. But yeah, so check it out. We've got the Zero Hour, right? I already showed you to it. You know, you're like, you've been holding that the whole time. We've got the Umbrella Conspiracy, which is based on the first game. Okay, but Zero Hour is based on Zero, right? And then this one's based on the first game. And then we've got Caliban Cove, which is based on Rebecca Chambers, and it is a original storyline for Resident Evil. And then we have The City of the Dead. This one is based on Resident Evil 2. It is the biggest book of them all, which is not that much, honestly, but it is 300 something pages. The other ones are like 250, something like that, I'm pretty sure. So this is like the biggest one of them all. This is the one that I was actually missing. I'm pretty sure I know who took it. It doesn't really matter, it's a long time ago. So I'm very happy that I got it back. Very happy indeed. Booyah, baby. And then we have The Underworld, which is a book that is based on Chris and Rebecca, and it is an original storyline. I know I'm kind of dragging this on here, my bad, guys. It's an original storyline. I'm just trying to think here for a second. It is original storyline. It's based in like Arizona or something like that, I'm pretty sure. The Caliban Cove is based in Maine, I believe. And then we've got Resident Evil Nemesis, which is based on the Resident Evil 3 game with Jill Valentine. And then we have Resident Evil Code Veronica, which is based on Code Veronica, and it is with Chris and Claire Redfield. Yep, there we go. All right. But that's it, man. This is just the intro to the beginning of the video because we're going to actually start watching. I'm going to start reading to you guys right now. So without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy this. It has been a long time coming, and it is fun to get back into reading again for sure. But I'm going to be reading to you guys, so I hope you enjoy it. This is the only time you guys are going to ever see me in the videos. It's just going to be blank background, so you can just listen. You don't have to watch my hand movements and whatever crazy shenanigans I'm wearing or whatnot. But yep, I hope you guys enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the book. Resident Evil Zero Hour, wrote by S.D. Perry. Hunger for power is evil's true root. Judith Murray. Prologue. The train swayed and rocked as it traveled through the Raccoon Woods. The thunder of its wheels echoed by a thundering twilight sky. Bill Nyberg rifled through the hardy file, his briefcase on the floor at his feet. It had been a long day, and the gentle rocking of the train soothed him. It was late, after 8, but the Ecliptic Express was mostly full, as it often was for dinner hour. It was a company train, and since the renovation, Umbrella had gone to great expense to make it classically retro. Everything from velvet seats to chandeliers in the dining car. A lot of employees brought family or friends along to experience the atmosphere. There were usually a number of out-of-towners on board as well. Having caught the connection out of Lantham, but Nyberg would have bet that 9 out of 10 of them worked for Umbrella too. Without the pharmaceutical giant's support, Raccoon City wouldn't even be a wide spot in the road. One of the car attendants walked past, nodding at Nyberg when he saw the umbrella pin on his lapel. The small pin marked him as a regular commuter. Nyberg nodded back. A flicker of lightning outside was quickly followed by another rumble of thunder. It seemed there was a summer storm brewing. Even in the cool comfort of the train, the air seemed charged, thick with the tension of impending rain. And my coat is in the trunk? Wonderful. His car was at the far end of the station lot, too. He'd be drenched before he got halfway across. Sighing, he returned his attention to the file, settling back into his seat. He'd already reviewed the material a number of times, but he wanted to be on top of every detail. A 10-year-old girl named Teresa Hardy had been involved in a clinical trial for a new pediatric heart medication, Valifen. As it turned out, the drug did exactly what it was supposed to do, but it also caused renal failure, and in Teresa Hardy's case, the damage had been severe. She'd survive, but would likely spend the rest of her life on dialysis, and the family's lawyers was seeking hefty damages. The case had to be settled quickly. The Hardy family kept quiet before they could drag their ailing, cherub-cheeked Moppet in front of a media-packed courtroom, which was where Nyberg and his team came in. The trick was to offer just enough to make the family happy, but not so much as to encourage their lawyer, one of those strip mall, we don't get paid unless you get paid outfits, to get greedy. Nyberg had a knack for handling ambulance chasers. He'd have it settled before little Teresa got back from her first treatment. It was what Umbrella paid him for. Rain splattered loudly against the window, as though someone had thrown a bucket of water against the pane. Startled, Nyberg turned to look out just as several dull thumps sounded on the train's roof. Terrific. Had to be hailstorm or something. A crackle of lightning flickered across the thick, opening darkness, illuminating the small but steep hill that marked the deepest part of the forest. Nyberg looked up and saw a tall figure silhouetted against the trees at the crest of the hill. Someone in a long coat or robe, the dark fabric rippling in the wind. The figure raised long arms to the raging sky, and the stutter of lightning was gone, plunging the strange, dramatic scene back into darkness. What the? Nyberg began, and more water splashed across the glass, except it wasn't water, because water didn't stick in great, dark clumps. Water didn't ooze and break apart, revealing dozens of shiny needle teeth. Nyberg blinked, not sure what he was seeing, as someone started to scream at the other end of the car. A long-rising wail, as more of the dark, slug-like creatures, each the size of a man's fist, smashed against the window. The sound of hail on the roof went from a patter to a storm. The thunder of its drowning out the screamer. The screams of many now. Not hail! That's not hail! Hot panic shot through Nyberg's body, sending him to his feet. He made it to the aisle before the glass behind him shattered. Before glass all through the train was shattering. The high, jagged sound of it melding with the screams of terror. All of it nearly lost beneath the ongoing thunder of attack. As the lights went out, something cold and wet and very much alive landed on the back of his neck and began to feed. Chapter 1. The helicopter spun through the darkness over Raccoon Forest. Rebecca Chambers sat up straight, willing herself to look as calm as the men around her. The mood was solemn, as dark and clouded as the skies whipping past. All jokes and jabs left behind at the briefing. This wasn't a training exercise. 3 more people, hikers, had gone missing. In a forest as large as the one surrounding Raccoon, not that unusual. But with the rash of savage murders that had terrorized the small city over the past several weeks, missing had taken on a new meaning. Only a few days earlier, there'd been a 9th victim found. This one as ripped up and savaged as if it had been run through a meat grinder. People were being killed, savagely attacked by someone or something around the outskirts of the city, and the Raccoon police weren't getting anywhere. The city's chapter of Stars had finally been calling in to investigate. Rebecca raised her chin slightly, a pulse of pride edging through her nervousness. Although her degree was in biochemistry, she'd been tapped as Bravo Team's field medic, joining the team less than a month earlier. My first mission, which means I'd better not cock it up. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, working to keep her expression casual. Edward shot her an encouraging smile and slowly leaned across the crowded cabin to reassuringly pat her leg. So much for looking cool. As smart as she was, as ready as she was to begin her career, she couldn't help her age, or the fact that she looked even younger. At 18, she was the youngest person to be accepted into the Stars since its creation in 1967. And as the only female on Raccoon's B team, everyone treated her like their kid sister. She sighed, smiling back at Edward, nodding at Sully. It wasn't so bad, having a handful of hard-ass big brothers watching out for her. As long as they understood, she could take care of herself when the need arose. I think, she silently amended. It was her first assignment, after all, and though she was in good shape physically, her combat experience had been limited to video simulations and weekend missions. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service wanted her in their labs, eventually, but field time was mandatory and she needed the experience. Anyway, they'd be sweeping the woods as a team. If they did run across the people or animals that had been attacking Raccoon citizens, she'd have backup. There was a flicker of lightning to the north, close, the subsequent thunder lost to the drone of the copter. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, scanning the dark. It had been clear all day, the clouds rolling in just before sunset. They were definitely going to go home wet. At least it would be a warm rain, she supposed. It could be a lot. Boom! She'd been so focused on the coming storm that for a crazed split second, she thought it was thunder. Even as the helicopter tipped wildly and dropped, a terrible rising, clattering whine filling the cabin, the floor vibrating beneath her boots, a hot smell of burned metal and ozone singeing her nose. Lightning? What happened? Someone shouted. Enrico, riding shotgun. Engine failure. The pilot, Kevin Dooley, shouted back. Emergency landing. Rebecca grabbed a strut and held on. Looked to the others so she wouldn't have to watch the trees rushing up at them. She saw the grim, determined set to Sully's jaw, Edward's clenched teeth. The look of anxiety shot between Richard and Forrest as they grabbed for struts or handholds on the shuddering wall. In the front, Enrico was shouting something else, something she couldn't make out over the scream of the dying engine. Rebecca closed her eyes for a beat, thought of her parents, and then the ride was too wild for her to think. The crack and crash of tree branches battering the helicopter too loud and jarring for her to do anything but hope. The copter spun out of control, whipping around in a tilting, sickening, lurching circle. It was over a second later, the silence, so sudden and complete that she thought she'd gone deaf. All movement stopped. Then she heard the tick of metal, the strangled last gasp of the engine, and her own thundering heart, and realized that they were down. Kevin had done it, and without a single bounce. Everyone okay? Enrico Marini, their captain, was craned around in his seat. Rebecca added her own shaky nod to the chorus of affirmations. Nice flying, Kev, Forrest said, as there was another chorus. Rebecca couldn't have agreed more. Is the radio down? Enrico asked the pilot, who was tapping at controls and flipping switches. Looks like everything electrical is fried, Kevin said. It must have been lightning. We weren't struck directly, but it was close enough. Beacon too. Can it be repaired? Enrico addressed it as an open question, looking at Richard, their communications officer. Richard, in turn, looked at Edward, who shrugged. Edward was the Bravo team's mechanic. I'll take a look, Edward said. But if Kev says the transmitter's toast, it's probably toast. The captain nodded slowly, absently brushing at his mustache, with one hand as he considered their options. After a few seconds, he sighed. I called in when we were hit, but I don't know if it went through, he said. They'll have our last coordinates, though. If we don't report in pretty soon, they'll come looking. They was Star's Alpha team. Rebecca nodded along with the others, not sure if she should be disappointed or not. Her first mission, over before it started. Enrico wiped at his mustache again, smoothing it down at the corners of his mouth with the thumb and forefinger of one hand. Everybody out. Let's see where we are. They filed out of the cabin, the reality of the situation hitting Rebecca as they gathered together in the dark. They were incredibly lucky to be alive, struck by lightning, on our way to search for mad killers, no less, she thought, amazed at the very idea. Even if the mission was over, this was hands down the most exciting thing that had ever happened to her. The air was warm and heavy with impending rain, the shadows deep. Small animals rustled through the underbrush. A pair of flashlights clicked on, the beams cutting through the dark as Enrico and Edward moved around the helicopter. Examining the damage, Rebecca fished her own flashlight out of her bag, relieved that she hadn't forgotten to pack it. How you holding up? Rebecca turned, saw Ken Sullivan grinning down at her. He had his weapon out, the 9mm muzzle pointed to the overcast sky, a grim reminder of why they were there in the first place. You guys really know how to make an entrance, don't you? She said, smiling back at him. The tall man laughed, his teeth very white against the darkness of his skin. Actually, we always do this for the new recruits. It's a waste of helicopters, but we have our reputation to maintain. She was about to ask how the police chief felt about the expense. She was new to the area, but she'd heard that Chief Irons was notoriously stingy. When Enrico joined them, pulling his own weapon and raising his voice so everyone could hear, "All right, people, let's fan out. Investigate the surrounding area. Kev, stay with the helicopter. The rest of you, keep close. I just want this area secured. Alpha could be here in as little as an hour." He didn't complete the thought, that it could be a hell of a lot longer. But he didn't need to. For the moment, at least, they were on their own. Rebecca slid the 9mm out of her holster, carefully checking the magazine and chamber as she'd been taught, raising the muzzle to avoid inadvertently aiming it at anyone. The others were moving out to either side, checking weapons and turning on flashlights. She took a deep breath and started to walk straight ahead, swinging the flashlight's beam around in front of her. Enrico was only a few meters away, moving parallel to her position. A low mist had cropped up, wafting through the underbrush like a ghostly tide. There was a parting in the trees about a dozen meters ahead, a path big enough to be a narrow road. Though it was hard to tell for the mist, it was quite except for the rumble of thunder, the sound closer than she would have expected. The storm was almost upon them. She swept the beam across the trees and darkness and trees again, then a glint of what looked like. Captain, look! Enrico stepped to her side, and within seconds, 5 more beams of light had jerked toward the gleam of metal she'd seen, illuminating what was, in fact, a narrow dirt road and an overturned jeep. Rebecca could see MP etched on the side as the team moved closer. Military police. She saw a pile of clothes spilling out from beneath the shattered windshield and frowned, stepping in for a better look. And then she was holstering her weapon and fumbling for her medkit, hurrying over to kneel next to the crashed jeep, knowing even before she sat back on her heels that there was nothing she could do. There was too much blood. 2 men. One had been thrown clear, was crumpled a few meters away. The other, the fair-haired man in front of her, was still half under the jeep. Both wore military fatigues. Their faces and upper bodies had been badly mutilated. There was massive tears through skin and muscle, deep gashes across their throats. No way the crash had done all of it. Rebecca reflexively reached down and felt for a pulse, noting the chill of the flesh. She stood and moved to the other body, again checking for any sign of life, but he was as cold as the first. "You think they're from Ragathon?" someone asked. Richard. Rebecca saw a briefcase near the pale, outstretched hand of the second corpse and walked to it, half listening to Enrico's answer as she flipped the case's lid. "It's the closest base, but look at the insignia. They're jarheads. Could be from Donnell," Enrico said. A clipboard was on top of a handful of files, an official-looking document attached to it. There was a small headshot in the upper left corner of a handsome, dark-eyed young man in civvies. Neither of the corpses looked like him. Rebecca lifted it out, reading silently, and then her mouth went dry. "Captain," she managed, standing. Enrico looked up from where he was crouched next to the jeep. What happened?" She read the pertinent parts aloud. "Court order for transportation. Prisoner William Cohen, ex-lieutenant, 26 years old. Court-martialed and sentenced to death, July 22nd. Prisoner is to be transferred to Ragathon Base for execution." The lieutenant had been convicted of first-degree murder. Edward pulled the clipboard from her hands, saying what was already formulating in Rebecca's mind, his voice heavy with anger. "Those poor soldiers. They were just doing their jobs, and that scum murdered them and escaped." Enrico took the clipboard away from him, scanning it quickly. "All right, everyone. Change of plan. We may have an escaped killer on our hands. Let's separate and survey the immediate area. See if we can't locate Lieutenant Billy. Keep your guard up and report back in 15 regardless." There were nods all around. Rebecca took a deep breath as others started to move out, checking her watch, determined to be a professional as anyone else on the team. 15 minutes alone, no big deal. What could happen in 15 minutes? Alone, in the dark, dark woods. "Got your radio?" Rebecca jumped and turned at the sound of Edward's voice, the big man standing directly behind her. The mechanic patted her on the shoulder, smiling. "Easy, kiddo." Rebecca smiled back at him, though she despised being called kiddo. Edward was only 26, for God's sakes. She tapped the unit on her belt. "Check." Edward nodded, stepping away. His message was clear and reassuring. She wasn't really alone, not as long as she had her radio. She looked around, saw that several of the others were already out of sight. Kevin, still in the pilot seat, was going through the briefcase that she'd found. He saw her and snapped her a salute. Rebecca gave him a thumbs up and squared her shoulders, drawing her weapon once more, and heading out into the night. Overhead, thunder rumbled. Scene break. Albert Wesker sat in the treatments plant, Con B1. The room dark except for the flicker from a bank of observation monitors. 6 of them, each changing view on 5-second rotations. There were shots from every level of the training facility. The upper and lower floors of the facility, of the factory, and the water treatment plant, and the tunnel that connected the two. He gazed at the soundless black and white screens without really looking at them. Most of his attention was focused on the incoming transmissions from the cleanup crew. The 3-man team, well 2 and a pilot, was en route by copter, and mostly silent. They were professionals, after all, not giving to macho banter or juvenile jokes, which meant Wesker was hearing a lot of static. That was all right. The white noise went well with the blank and staring faces he saw on the monitors. The ravaged bodies slumped in corners. The men who'd been infected shambling aimlessly through empty corridors. Like the Arclay mansion and labs only a few miles away, White Umbrella's private training grounds and connected facilities had been hit by the virus. ETA 35 minutes. Over, the pilot said, his voice crackling through the dimly lit room. Wesker leaned in. Copy that. Silence again. There was no need to talk about what would happen when they reached the train. And though the channel was scrambled, it was best not to say more than what was necessary, anyway. Umbrella had been built on a foundation of secrecy, a characteristic of the pharmaceutical giant that was still honored by everyone in the upper echelons of management. Even in the company's legitimate dealings, the less said, the better. It's all coming down, Wesker said, thought idly. Watching the screens, Spencer's mansion and the surrounding labs had gone down in the middle of May. White Umbrella's take on it had been accidental. The lab locked down until the infected researchers and staff became ineffective. Mistakes happened, after all, but the training facility nightmare that was still playing out in front of him had followed not a month later. And only a few hours ago, the engineer of Umbrella's private train, the Ecliptic Express, had pushed the biohazard panic button. So, the lockdown didn't work. The virus leaked and spread. It's that simple, isn't it? There were a handful of infected grunts in the training facility's dining room, one of them walking in looping circles around the once handsome table. He was leaking some viscous fluid out of a nasty head wound as he staggered along, oblivious to his whereabouts, to pain, to everything. Wesker tapped at the control panel beneath the monitor, keeping the surveillance from moving to the next picture. He sat back in his chair, watching the doomed walker as he circled the table yet again. Sabotage, maybe, he said softly. He couldn't be sure. It was set up to look natural. A spill at the Arclay lab, an incomplete lockdown, a few weeks later, a couple of missing hikers, likely caused by an escaped test subject or two, and a few weeks more, infection at the second White Umbrella facility. It was highly improbable that one of the virus carriers would just happen to blunder their way to one of Raccoon's other labs. But it was possible. Except now there was the train to consider, and it didn't feel like an accident. It felt planned. Hell, I might have done it myself if I'd thought of it. He'd been looking for a way out for some time now, tired of working for people who were obviously his inferiors, and well aware that too much time on White Umbrella's payroll wasn't good for the health. Now they wanted him to lead the stars into the Arclay mansion and labs, to find out just how well Umbrella's war pets fared against armed soldiers. Did they give a shit if he died in the process? Not so long as he recorded the data first, he was sure. Researchers, doctors, techs, anyone who worked for White Umbrella for more than a decade or two had a habit of winding up missing or dead. Eventually, George Trevor and his family, Dr. Marcus, Dees, Dr. Darius, Alexander Ashford, and those were just some of the bigger names. God only knew how many of the little people had ended up in shallow graves somewhere, or turned up as test subjects A, B, and C. The corner of Wesker's mouth twitched. Come to think of it, he had a fairly good idea of how many. He'd been working for White Umbrella since the late 70s, most of that in the Raccoon area, and had watched the docs run through quite a few test subjects. Many he had helped procure himself. It was well past his time to get out, and if he could get the data the big boys wanted, he might just be able to throw himself a little bidding war. A going-away present to fund his retirement. White Umbrella wasn't the only group interested in bioweapons research. But first, a cleanup for the train. And this place, he thought, watching as a soldier with a head wound tripped over a chair leg and went down hard. The training facility was connected to the private water treatment plant by an underground tunnel. It would all have to be cleared. A few seconds passed, and the soldier on screen staggered to his feet again, continuing on his mindless quest to nowhere. And now there appeared to be a dinner fork sticking out of his upper right shoulder, a little souvenir from his fall. The soldier didn't notice, of course, a charming little disease. It had been the same kind of scene at the Arclay Labs. Wesker was sure. The last few desperate phone calls from the quarantine lab had painted a vivid picture of just how effective the T virus really was. That would have to be cleaned up too. But not until after he got the stars out there for a little training exercise. It would be an interesting match. The stars were good. He'd handpicked half of them himself, but they'd never seen anything like the T virus. The dying soldier on the screen was a prime example. Hot with the recombinant virus, he went on with his endless tour of the dining room. Slow and mostly brainless, he also felt no pain, and he would attack anyone or anything that happened across his path with no hesitation. The virus continually seeking new hosts to infect. Although the original spill was allegedly airborne, after this long, the virus would only be spread by bodily fluids, by blood, or, say, a bite. And the soldier's was just a man. After all, the T-virus worked on all manners of living tissue, and there were a number of other animals to see in action, from laboratory triumphs to local wildlife. Enrico should have the Bravos out by now, searching for the latest missing hikers, but it was doubtful they'd find anything where he was planning to look. Sometime soon, Wesker would see about organizing an Alpha Bravo campout at the deserted Spencer mansion. Then he'd wipe out the evidence and be on his merry, wealthy way to hell with White Umbrella, to hell with his life as a double agent, playing with the petty lives of men and women he didn't give a shit about. The dying man on the screen fell down once more again, dragged himself to his feet and soldiered on. "Go for the gold, baby," Wesker said, and chuckled, the sound echoing out through the empty dark. Scene change. Something moved in the bushes, something bigger than a squirrel. Rebecca spun toward the sound, aiming the flashlight and 9mm at the shrub. The light caught the last of the movement, the leaves still shaking, the beam from her flashlight trembling along with them. She took a step closer, swallowing dryly, counting backward from 10. Whatever it was gone now. A raccoon is all, or maybe somebody's dog got loose. She looked at her watch, sure that it must be time to head back, and saw that she'd been on her way for just over 5 minutes. She hadn't seen or heard anyone else since she'd walked away from the helicopter. It was as though everyone else had fallen off the face of the earth. Or I have, she thought darkly, lowering the handgun slightly, turning to check her position. She'd been heading roughly southwest from the landing point. She'd continue on for a few more minutes. Then Rebecca blinked, surprised to see a metal wall beneath the flashlight's beam, not 10 meters away. She played the light across the surface, saw the windows, a door. A train, she breathed, frowning slightly. It seemed like she remembered something about a track up here. Umbrella, the pharmaceutical corporation, had a private line that ran from Latham to Raccoon City, didn't they? She wasn't too certain on the history. She wasn't a local, but she was pretty sure the company had been founded in Raccoon. Umbrella's headquarters had moved off to Europe some time ago, but they still owned practically the entire town. So what's it doing sitting up here, dead in the woods at this time of night? She ran the light up and down the train, saw that there were 5 tall cars, each 2 stories high. Ecliptic Express was written just below the roof of the car in front of her. There were a few lights on, but they were faint, barely casting through the windows, several of which were broken. She thought she saw a person's silhouette near one of the unbroken ones, but it wasn't moving. Someone's asleep, maybe, or hurt, or dead. Maybe this thing is stopped because Billy Cohen found his way back onto the track. God, that was a thought. He could be inside now, with hostages. She should definitely call for backup. She started to reach for her radio, and then paused. Or maybe the train broke down 2 weeks ago, and it's been here ever since, and all you'll find inside is a colony of woodchucks. Wouldn't the team have a laugh over that? They'd be nice about it, but she'd have to endure weeks, maybe months of gentle ribbing, calling for backup over a deserted train. She checked her watch again, saw that the 2 minutes had passed since the last check, and felt a drop of cool liquid splash on her nose, then another on her arm, then the soft, musical patter of 100 drops against leaves and dirt, then thousands as the sky opened up, the storm finally beginning. The rain decided it for her. A quick look inside before she headed back, just to make sure everything was the way it was supposed to be. If Billy wasn't around, she'd at least be able to report back that the train appeared to be clear, and if he was. "You'll have to deal with me," she murmured, the sound lost to the growing storm as she approached the silent train. Chapter 2. Billy sat on the floor between 2 rows of seats, working at the handcuffs with a paperclip he'd found on the floor. One of the cuffs was off, the right one, bashed open when the Jeep had gone over, but unless he wanted to be wearing a jangling and rather incriminating bracelet, he had to get the other one off. Get it off and get the hell out of here, he thought, pushing at the lock with the thin piece of metal. He didn't look up, didn't need to remind himself of his whereabouts. He didn't have to. The air was heavy with the scent of blood. It was splattered all over the place, and although the train car he'd found was empty of bodies, he had no doubt that the other cars were full of them. The dogs. Had to be those dogs. Though who let them on? The same guy they'd seen in the woods. Had to be. The guy who'd stepped in front of the Jeep, sending it crashing out of control. Billy had been thrown clear except for a few bruises, was pretty much unscathed. His MP escort, Dixon and Elder, had both been trapped beneath the overturned vehicle. They'd been alive, though. The human roadstop, whoever he was nowhere to be seen. It had been a tough minute or two, standing there in the gathering dark, the hot, oily smell of gas in his face, his body aching, trying to decide, run for it or radio for help. He didn't want to die. didn't deserve to die, unless being trusting and stupid was an offense worthy of death. But he couldn't leave them, either. Two men pinned under a ton of twisted metal, injured and barely conscious. Their choice, to take some unpaved backwoods trail to the base, meant it could be a long time before anyone happened upon them. Yeah, they were delivering him to his execution, but they were following orders. It wasn't personal, and they didn't deserve to die any more than he did. He decided to split the difference, radio for help, then run like hell. But then the dogs had come. Big, wet, freaky-looking things. 3 of them. And then he was running for his life, because there was something very, very wrong about them. He knew it even before they'd attacked Dixon, ripping his throat out as they pulled him from beneath the Jeep. Billy thought he heard a click and tried the handcuff, hissing air through his teeth when the metal latch refused to budge. Goddamn thing. The paperclip was a lucky find, though there was shit everywhere. Papers, bags, coats, personal belongings, and blood on just about all of it. Maybe he'd find something more useful if he looked harder. Though that would mean staying on the train, and that didn't sound like much fun at all. For all he knew, this was where those dogs lived, holed up here with that crazy asshole who liked to step in front of moving cars. He'd only come aboard to avoid the dogs, to regroup, try and figure out his next move. And it turns out to be the Slaughterhouse Special, he thought, shaking his head. Talk about out of the frying pan and into the fire. Whatever the hell was going on out in these woods, he didn't want to be a part of it. He'd get the cuff off, find himself some kind of weapon, maybe grab a wallet or two out of all the blood-splattered luggage. He had no doubt that the owners were long past caring, and hightail it back to civilization, then Canada, or Mexico maybe. He'd never stolen before, never considered leaving the country, but he had to think like a criminal now, if he wanted to survive. He heard thunder, then gentle taps of rain against some of the unbroken windows. The taps became a tattoo, the blood-scented air thinning with a gust of wind through a shattered pane. Dandy, apparently. He'd be hiking out in a rainstorm. Whatever, he mumbled, and threw the useless paperclip against the seat in front of him. The situation was seriously foobar. He doubted it could get much worse. Billy froze, held his breath. The outside door to the train was opening. He could hear the metal sliding, the rain getting louder, then quieter again. Someone had come aboard. Shit! What if it was the maniac with the dogs? Or what if someone found the Jeep? He felt a sick, heavy knot in his stomach. Could be. Could be that someone else from the base had decided to use the back road tonight. Maybe had already called in when they'd seen the crash, and learned that there should have been a third passenger, a certain dead man walking. Maybe he was already being hunted. He didn't move, straining to hear the movements of whoever had come in from the rain. For a few seconds, nothing. Then he heard a soft tread, one step, then another, moving away from him, toward the front of the car. Billy leaned forward, carefully sliding his dog tags under his collar so they wouldn't jingle, moving slowly until he could just see around the edge of the aisle seat. Someone was stepping through the connecting door, thin, short, a girl or a young man, maybe, dressed in a Kevlar vest in army green. He could just make out the few letters on the back of the vest, an S, a T, an A, and then he or she was gone. Stars. Had they sent out a team looking for him? Couldn't be. Not so fast. The Jeep had crashed maybe an hour ago, tops, and the Stars didn't have a military affiliation. They were a PD offshoot. No one would have called them in. It probably had to do with the dogs he saw. Obviously some mutant feral pack. The Stars usually dealt with the weird shit that local cops couldn't or wouldn't handle. Or maybe they'd come in to investigate whatever had gone down on the train. Doesn't matter. Why? Does it? They'll have guns, and if they figure out who you are, this taste of freedom will be your last. Get out of here. Now. With man-eating dogs running around in the woods? Not without a weapon. No way. There had to be some kind of security on board. A rented uniform with a gun. He just had to look. It would be a risk with a stars on board, but there was only one of them, after all, if he had to. Billy shook his head. He'd seen his share of death in special forces. If it came down to it, here and now, he'd fight or run. He wouldn't kill, nor ever again. Not ever again. At least not one of the good guys. Billy crawled to his feet, keeping low, the handcuffs dangling from his wrist. He'd look through the stuff in this car first, then move away from the Star's interloper. See what he could find. No point in having a confrontation if it could be avoided. He'd just bam, bam, bam. 3 shots from the car ahead. A pause, then 3, 4 more, and then nothing. Apparently not all the train cars were empty. The knot in his stomach tightened, but he didn't let it slow him down as he picked up the first briefcase he saw and started to dig. Scene change. The first train car was empty of life, but something very bad had occurred there. No question. A crash? No, there's no structural damage. But so much blood! Rebecca closed the door behind her, shutting out the thickening curtain of rain, and stared at the chaos around her. The cabin had been a nice one, all dark wood and expensive carpeting. The light fixtures, antique, the wallpaper flocked. Now there were newspapers, suitcases, coats, bags open and spilled across the floor. It looked like there'd been a crash, and the drips and smears of blood that liberally dabbled the cabin's walls and seats backed up the scenario. Except, where were the passengers? She stepped further into the train car, aiming the handgun up and down the aisle. There were a few low lights on, enough to see, but the shadows were deep. Nothing moved. The back of the seat to her left was stained with blood. She reached out and touched the large splotch, then wiped her hand on her pants, grimacing. It was wet. Lights are on. Blood's fresh. Whatever happened, it happened recently. Lieutenant Billy, maybe? He was wanted for murder. Unless he had a gang with him, though, it didn't seem likely. The destruction was too widespread, too extreme. More like a natural disaster than some kind of hostage situation. Or more like the forest murders. She nodded inwardly, taking a deep breath. The killers must have struck again. The bodies that had been recovered had been torn apart, mutilated, and the crime scenes had probably looked exactly like this blood-splattered train car. She should get off now, radio the captain, call in the rest of the team. She started to turn back to the door and hesitated. I could secure the train first. Ridiculous. It would be crazy to stay here by herself, stupid and dangerous. No one would expect her to check out a murder scene alone, assuming anyone had been murdered. For all she knew, there'd been a shooting or something, and the train had been evacuated. No, that's stupid. There'd be cops all over the place, EMTs, helicopters, reporters. Whatever happened here, I'm the first one on the scene. And securing the scene is the first priority. She couldn't help wondering what the guys might say when they saw she'd handled things herself. They'd stop calling her kiddo, for one thing. At the very least, her rookie status would be behind her that much quicker. She could take a quick look around. Nothing major, and if things seemed even a slightest bit of dangerous, she'd call in the team, pronto. She nodded to herself. Right. She could handle a look-see, no problem. A deep breath, and she started for the front of the car, carefully stepping through the scattered luggage. When she reached the connecting door, she braced herself, and quickly stepped through the opening, the second door before she lost her nerve. Oh no. The first car had been bad, but here there were people, 3, 4, 5, that she could see from where she stood, and all of them obviously dead. Faces ravaged by unknown claws, bodies drenched in dark wetness. A few were slumped in seats, as if they had been brutally murdered where they'd been sitting. The smell of death was a palpable thing, like copper and feces, like rotting fruit on a hot day. The door automatically closed behind her, and she started, her heart beating fast, faintly aware that she was way out of her league. She needed to call for help, and then she heard the whispering, and realized that she wasn't alone. She aimed her weapon at the empty aisle ahead, not sure where it was coming from, her heartbeat going double time. "Identify yourself," she said, her voice firmer and more authoritative than she expected. The whispering continued, choking and distant, strangely muted in the otherwise silent car, like she imagined a crazed killer might sound, sitting and whispering to himself after a murder spree. She was about to repeat herself when she saw the source of the whispering. Halfway up the aisle, on the floor, it was a tiny transistor radio, apparently tuned to an AM news radio station. She walked toward it, dazed by a sudden rush of relief. She was alone, after all. She stopped in front of the radio, lowering her semi-automatic. There was a body in the window seat to her left, and after an initial glance, she avoided looking at it. The man's throat had been slashed, and his eyes had rolled back into his head. His gray face and tattered clothes were shining with viscous-looking fluids, making him look like a zombie from a bad horror movie. She bent and picked the radio up, smirking at herself in spite of the fear that still coursed through her. Her crazed killer was a woman delivering a news report. The reception was bad, the tiny unit hissing static at every other sentence. Okay, so she was an idiot. In any case, it was time to call Enrico and Rebecca. Turned, thinking she'd get better reception if she stepped back outside, and the movement that came from the window seat was so slow and subtle that for a moment she thought it was just the rain she was seeing. Then the movement groaned, a deep, low sound of misery, and she understood that it wasn't the rain at all. The corpse had risen from his seat and was moving toward her, his misshapen head lolled back into the side, cruelly exposing the mauled flesh of his throat. The moaning grew deeper, more yearning, as it stretched his arms out in front of him, his ruined face dripping blood and slime. She dropped the radio and took one stumbling step back, horrified. She'd been wrong. He wasn't dead, but he was obviously out of his mind with pain. She had to help him. Not much in the med kit. There's morphine, though. Gotta get him to lay down. Oh God, what happened here? The man shuffled closer, reaching for her, his eye sockets filled with white, black drool spilling from his torn mouth. And in spite of what she knew was her duty, to do something to relieve his suffering, she reflexively took another step back. Duty was one thing. Her instincts were telling her to run, to get away. That he meant to do her harm. She turned, not sure what to do, and there were two more people standing in the aisle behind her, both as slack-faced and damaged as the white-eyed man, both moving toward her with the steady, staggering movements of horror movie monsters. The man in front wore a uniform. He was some kind of train attendant, his face gaunt, skull-like, and gray. Behind him, a man whose face had been partly torn away, revealing too many teeth on the right side of his mouth. Rebecca shook her head, raising her weapon. Some kind of disease, a chemical spill, or something. They were sick. They had to be sick. Except she knew better, even as the three men moved closer, raising bony gray fingers, moaning with hunger. Maybe they were sick, but they were also about to attack her. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. "Shoot! Do it! Stop!" she shouted, turning back to the white-eyed man. He was closer, too close, and if he was aware that she was pointing a handgun at him, he gave no sign. "I'll shoot!" Ah! The monster rasped, grasping for her, baring dark teeth, and Rebecca fired. 2, 3 shots, the rounds tearing into discolored flesh, the first 2 hitting his chest, the third blowing a hole just above his right eye. With the third shot, the creature let out a mindless squeal, a sound of frustration rather than pain, and fell to the floor. She spun again, praying that the sound of shots had stopped the other 2, and saw that they were almost upon her, their eyes glazed, their moans eager. Her first shot hit the uniformed man in the throat, and as he reeled back, she aimed for the second man's leg. "Maybe I can just wound him. Get him down." The uniformed man started forward again, his throat gurgling blood. "God," she said. Her voice small with shock, but they were still coming. She didn't have time to wonder, to think. She raised her aim and fired 2, 3 more times, all headshots. Blood and flesh sprayed, torn. The 2 men went down. Sudden silence, stillness, and Rebecca's wide gaze searched the car, her body thrumming with adrenaline. There were 2, 3 more corpses, but none of them moved. What just happened? I thought they were all dead. They were dead. They were zombies. No, there was no such thing. Rebecca checked to be sure that there was another round in the chamber, doing it automatically as she struggled to understand. They weren't zombies, not like in the movies. If they'd truly been dead, the shots wouldn't have made them bleed like that. Blood didn't pump if the heart wasn't beating. But they only went down after headshots. True, but that could still mean some sort of disease. Maybe something that blocked pain receptors. The forced murders. Rebecca felt her eyes widen even more, putting the pieces together. If there had been some kind of chemical spill or sickness, it might have affected any number of people up here in the woods, making them attack others. There had been recent reports of wild feral dogs, too. Was it possible that the sickness was trans-species? Some of the victims had been partially eaten, bites made by human and animal jaws on at least 2 of the bodies. She heard a soft movement and stopped breathing. Back by the door she'd come through, a seated corpse seemed to slump lower in its seat. She watched it for what seemed an eternity, but it didn't move again. The only sound, that of the rain outside. Corpse, or victim, of some tragic circumstance. She didn't want to find out. Rebecca backed away, stepping over the man with white eyes, now very much dead. Deciding, she tried at the door at the front of the car. She had to get off the train, tell the others what she'd found. Her head spun with what needed to happen next. The community would have to be alerted, a quarantine set up right away. The federal government should get involved, too. The CDC or the USAMRD, or maybe the EPA. An agency with the power to close everything down, figure out what had happened. It would be a huge undertaking, but she could really contribute, really make a... The corpse at the back of the car shifted again, its head settling against its chest, and all the thought-saving raccoon fled from her shocked mind. Rebecca turned and ran to the connecting door, sick with fear. All she wanted was out. Scene change. It didn't take too long to find a weapon, and as luck would have it, Billy was intimately familiar with the standard issue MP handgun he found in a duffel bag stuffed under a seat. It was the same kind that his escort had carried. There was a spare clip and a half box of 9x19mm parabellum rounds, too, as well as flip-top lighter. Another handy device to have around. One never knew when fire might be necessary. He loaded up, stuffing the clip into his belt, the extra rounds into his front pockets, wishing he had his fatigues on instead of civvies. Blue jeans weren't the best for carrying shit around. He started to look for a jacket, then decided against it. Even with the rain, it was a warm night, and slogging around in wet denim would be bad enough. The small pockets would have to do. He stood at the door that led back into the woods, weapon in hand, telling himself that he needed to get gone, and yet not leaving. He hadn't heard anything from the stars, kid, since those 7 shots. Only a few minutes had passed. If the kid was in trouble, it wasn't too late for him to step in and... Are you crazy? His brain shouted at him. Go! Run, you idiot! Right, of course. He had to leave, but he couldn't get the ring of those shots out of his head, and he'd spent too long as one of the good guys to turn his back on one of them. If they needed help... Besides, if the kid was dead, that would mean an extra weapon. Yeah, that's it. He mumbled, perfectly aware that he was searching for a more criminal-minded reason to justify his decision. There was no help for it. He had to go look. With an internal groan, Billy turned away from the door, from freedom, moving instead to the front of the car. He stepped through the first door, hesitating a beat in the connecting joint before grasping the handle to the second, into the next car. The only sound was the rain outside, working its way into a real storm. As quietly as he could, he slid the second door open and stepped through. The unmistakable smell hit him first. His jaw tightened as he surveyed the car, counting heads. 3 in the aisle, 2 up ahead on the right, and 1 directly to his left, slumped down in a seat, all of them dead. The man in the road. Billy frowned, realizing that any one of the corpses around him could have passed for the dork who'd stepped in front of the Jeep, causing the crash. He'd only caught a glimpse of the guy, but remembered thinking that he looked sick. Maybe one of these people. But no, they'd been dead for days. So what was the kid shooting at? Billy moved closer to the nearest corpse, squatting next to it, taking in the wounds with a trained eye as he breathed shallowly through his mouth. The guy had been dead for a while. Part of his right cheek was missing, making him appear to grin widely up at Billy. And the edges of the torn tissue were rotting, black with decay, and yet there were 2 bullet holes in his brow, and a pool of very fresh blood surrounded his head and upper body like a red shadow. Billy touched the pool with the side of his hand, his frown deepening. It was warm. The next closest body, a train attendant, looked pretty much the same. Only one of the wounds was in his throat. He was no Einstein, but he wasn't entirely incapable of logic either. The fresh blood could only mean that these people just looked dead, and the fact that they were now full of holes suggested that they'd tried to attack the Lone Stars member. Which means I'd better be damned careful, he thought, rising to his feet. He looked back at the body in the seat now behind him, his gaze narrowing. Had the man moved, or was it a trick of the light? Either way, he'd just as soon be somewhere else. He hurried up the aisle, stepping over the corpses, trying to watch all of them at once, and cursing his need to find the Stars kid. If only he didn't have a goddamn conscience, he'd be long gone by now. He slipped through the 2 doors, weapon ready, as he entered the next car. It wasn't a passenger car. It wasn't as nicely decorated. From the entrance, he could only see a short corridor that turned up ahead, and 2 closed doors to his right, a few windows opposite. He considered checking the rooms, aware that it would be the smartest move. Turning your back to an unsecured area was a bad call, but he was starting to think that his conscience could go screw. He didn't want to secure the entire train. He just wanted to see that the kid was okay and then get the hell out. And if said kid doesn't show up in the next couple of minutes, I'm deboarding anyhow. This sucks. Sucks wasn't the word. It didn't begin to describe how low terror he felt in his gut, but he'd seen fear cripple the strongest men, and knew better than to dwell on thoughts of monsters and darkness. Better to laugh it off as a bad dream and get on with things. He edged down the corridor, moving silently, sliding along the wall as the hall jagged right, and then continued on, past an open door with a spill of cardboard boxes blocking the entrance. Storage room, maybe. Probably. There were no bodies, at least, but a smell of rot hung in the air. The few unbroken windows he passed reflected a pale shadow of himself. Only blackness and rain outside. He noted with dismay that some of the glass from the shattered panes was inside the car, scattered across the dark wood floor, which suggested that someone had been trying to get in, not out. Creepy. It looked like the corridor jagged left up ahead, just past another closed door labeled Conductor's Office. He had to be near the front by now, and he saw a second pale shadow up ahead, reflected in a window, directly past the turn. He stopped, held very still, watched as the figure crouched down, his or her back to the corridor, oblivious to any threat from behind. If it was the stars, he or she needed more training. Billy took the last few steps and raised his weapon, moving in behind the crouched figure. He knew he should avoid a confrontation. The kid was obviously fine and dandy, and he had other places to be, but he also wanted to know what was happening, and this might be his only chance for information. The STARS member turned, saw Billy, and slowly stood up, facing him. Kid isn't far off the mark, he thought, staring down into the wide, innocent eyes of a teenager. A girl. God, were they hiring out of high schools these days? She was small, at least a half-foot shorter than he, and pretty. Reddish-brown hair, slim, muscular build, even, delicate features. If she weighed more than 100 pounds, he would have been surprised. She'd been crouching in front of a dead man, his savage body slouched in the corner next to the car's exit. If she was surprised to see him, she hid it well. "Billy," she said, her young voice clear and melodic, her words making him grit his teeth. "Lieutenant Cohen." Shit, someone had found the Jeep after all. He kept the gun raised, aimed directly at her right eye, playing it cool. "So, you seem to know me. Been fantasizing about me, have you?" "You were the prisoner being transferred for execution," she said, her voice taking on a hard edge. "You were with those soldiers outside." She thinks I did it, that I killed them, he thought. It was written all over her pixie face. He realized then that she probably didn't know a thing about what was going on. If she hadn't connected the walking corpse guys to what had happened to the Jeep, and he saw no reason to disillusion her. She was trying to look tough, and he could see that he intimidated her. He could use it to get out of this. "Uh-huh, I see," he said. "You're with STARS. Well, no offense, honey, but your kind doesn't seem to want me around, so I'm afraid our little chat time is over." He lowered his gun and then turned and walked away, his gait easy and unhurried, as though he wasn't the slightest bit concerned by her presence. He was counting on her obvious inexperience and fear of him to keep her from acting. It was a calculated risk, but he thought it would pay off. He tucked his weapon into his belt at the small of his back and was halfway back down the corridor when he heard her jogging to catch up. Shit. "Wait, you're under arrest," she said firmly. He turned to face her and saw that she hadn't even unholstered her weapon. She was doing her damnedest to look fierce, but she couldn't pull it off. If the situation had been less serious, any less bizarre, he would have smiled. "No thanks, dollface. I've already worn the handcuffs," he said, holding up his left hand and jangling the hanging cuff. He turned and started away again. "I could shoot, you know," she called after him. But now there was an edge of desperation to her voice. He kept walking. She didn't follow, and a few seconds later, he was back through the first connecting door. He opened the door to the car of dead passengers, wearing a shaky grin, relieved. It was better this way, every man for himself and all that. And he saw that the dead man who'd been slumped in his seat at the back was now standing, swaying, his remaining eye fixed on Billy's position. With a moan of hunger, the creature shambled forward, reaching out with shredded fingers, as though to feel his way to where Billy stood. And that is the end of the prologue 1, 2, technically 3 chapters altogether. We're going to start chapter 3 on the next video, but that is going to be it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed the audiobook. I haven't read these books in like 10 years, give or take, so it's pretty nice to get back to something I definitely enjoyed. And I mean, I really enjoyed Resident Evil as I was growing up, so that is what made me decide to get these books. I hope you guys enjoy it, but that is going to be it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Let me know if you guys did enjoy it in the comment section, and hit that like button. But that's going to be it. Have a wonderful day. Don't forget to bring a towel. Peace out.
You want to know how I got these scars?
Shut up, Mimsy!